Okay, welcome all of you to this session, which is part of a series of AFD Tech Talk, which is centered on how do we leverage data and emerging technologies for development. So most often than not, we do invite thought leadership, thought experts in these domains to come and talk about finance, either through projects, either through research initiatives or experimentations, and to share their knowledge on some of the topics. And we are glad to have you here, and then we do also have participants, obviously, online watching us from different locations. And to all participants online, welcome to this particular session, which is on ethical data reuse in developing countries. So how do we develop responsible data reuse in developing countries? So this session is actually in line with a technical report that was prepared in collaboration with the data tank, with the IFD. And the whole idea is that, we started thinking about the emergence of AI and also datafication. We noticed that obviously AI leverages on data, and we all agree that data governance does play a significant role in that, right? And we also started looking at ways in which we can build new framework on the reuse of data. Stefaan will be talking about some of these later in the presentation. And I'm so happy to have all of you here. I'll leave you, Amandine, to present the speakers, and then we kickstart the conversation. And we will allow room for more questions, because that's the essence of this session. We would like to have much more like a conversation and not just a panel, and at the end of the day we end. We just want to have more conversations on that. So we'll keep the presentation pretty short and then opening for more interactions. Amandine.
Thank you, Peter. So I will be very brief. So thank you, Laura SANDOR and Stefaan VERHULST, for presenting your work at the Data Tank and GovLab.
Getting going? All right, great, cool. Well, thanks everyone, and thanks Amandine and Peter for the kind introduction, and also for the partnership in actually establishing what we see as kind of a new pathway to unlock some of the data for reuse, but doing so in a way that is systematic, sustainable, and above all, responsible. And it all starts with the observation that many of you, of course, are well aware of, and that is also explains to a large extent why we actually have this breakthrough in artificial intelligence today, which is really that digitalization has led to datafication. And I think for many of you that have been part of the digital transformation movement, that was quite often not the realization at the early days. At the early days was all about digital automation and so on. But actually what really happened is actually the fact that every transaction, every digital enabled activity has a data trail, and as a result we actually have seen a massive datafication. Now, on the one hand, of course, that can be problematic. On the other hand, that can also be tremendously beneficial, mainly because digital data actually allows for reuse for other purposes than initially intended. And I think that's the real opportunity, which also means that we have a lot of kind of not only more data, but we also have a lot of different types of data that actually allows for data reuse. And this is just kind of an overview of the different types of data that have been used for COVID, for instance, which we typically call kind of the non-traditional data that actually suddenly have gained value for reusers. And of course, what is uniquely about quite often those non-traditional data as opposed to the traditional kind of tabular data is that these are the kind of data sets that are uniquely well positioned for training generative AI, because most of the generative AI training sets are actually unstructured data as opposed to tabular data. And so it's the creation the datafication that has led to this non-traditional data set that then can be reused for other purposes, including generative AI.
A quick question, Stefaan, on definition. What is traditional data? Yes.
Yeah, well, traditional data, as I mentioned, is typically, and I have a slide here, but it's typically kind of the tabular data that is collected in a structured way, quite often through surveys or through, for instance, administrative means, right?
National statistical
National
institutions.
statistics,
Okay.
exactly. And so what we see is that we have now a lot of additional data that can be reused for purposes such as, for instance, understanding COVID, as many of you, of course, were part of. COVID tapped into cell phone data in order to understand the spread of disease, but also can be used, which we've heard over and over again, for increasing productivity as relates to farming or to handle crisis response as well. At the same time, of course, we have a whole range of challenges, especially within the kind of the low and middle income countries context. We have challenges on the side of the supply, right? Quite often lack of capacity, but also lack of quality is a real concern when we start reusing the data for other purposes. But we also have concerns and we have challenges at the demand side. And quite often the demand side, of course, has poor literacy, but, and that's where we started focusing on, there's actually also very limited agency in how the data, the supply, the increased supply of data, and especially non-traditional data, is being reused for other purposes. And so we start, and the report starts from this assumption and the observation that we have a data asymmetry, where there is, on the one hand, those that need data quite often don't have the data, despite the fact that the data is somewhere collected. So we have a data asymmetry, but more importantly, we also have an agency asymmetry, where actually those that quite often are in the data or have an interest in the data have no meaningful way to actually express their preferences and their expectations to determine how the data can be reused in a way that is beneficial to their community, to their society as well. And that's basically the starting point of this report, is that while we have focused a lot on actually the potential of data reuse, we have not done enough work, from my point of view, on actually how do we establish a certain notion of self-determination in how that data is then subsequently being reused, including self-determination with regard to whether this data should be training data for instance, generative AI.
Quick one, self-determination. Yeah. I'm just trying to break it down to the audience.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Well, self-determination basically means and with the self, I don't mean the individual per se, right? The self could be the community, but it's basically a way to determine the conditions under which and the purposes for which data can be reused. And that could be on the extreme, could be full control, right? And that's why some are advocating for actually more indigenous control, for instance, and data sovereignty. But it could also be a level of self-determination without full control. But I think we can argue, anyway, what's the adequate spectrum? But I think it's really about kind of the reintroducing the principle of self-determination. I mean, this morning there was a lot of discussion about human rights, but I think self-determination actually needs to be reimagined in a context of data reuse as well. Now, obviously, you could say there is already some agency in determining the use for data, and typically that, of course, is crystallized and centralized around this notion of consent, right? Especially when it comes to personal data. Now, consent, from my point of view, is a fundamental principle that we should sustain. Yeah. Unfortunately, it's also a very flawed practice, right? For a variety of reasons. One is that it's quite often never fully informed. Two, it's quite often binary, right? It's either yes or no, and you cannot really engage on, well, it depends. And the last concern that I have with consent is that it's individual, always individual, which means that given the fact that data is quite often relational, my data says something about my family, says something about my community, but they never are part of actually the conversation and the deliberation around how that data should be reused as well. Now, there are other efforts. I'm not going to go and assess all the other efforts, but from my point of view, we've come to the kind of observation that we really need innovation in establishing collective agency around how data is being reused for other purposes than the initial purpose for which the data was collected as well. And that's where we started looking into this concept of the social license, where we actually need to establish a social license that express the community preferences and expectations with regard to how data is being used. And there are two traditions that we build ourselves, or that we are anyway building upon. One tradition is kind of the social license within the context of the extractives industries. Many who have worked on kind of the extractives industries, there the social license is very well established, because there it's about, if you want to extract assets from a community, you cannot do that without obtaining a social license for doing so, which then, where communities are clearly identifying, this is how we want you to give back to our community if you extract kind of assets. And so that's kind of one extreme, and where we would almost see data as kind of a similar kind of environment. I would not go to anyway saying that it's always extractive, but at the same time, I think we can learn from that. And the other tradition is basically the social license for doing business. Ultimately, and that's well established even in corporate law, meaning if you establish a business, and especially a limited liability corporation, the expectation there is that you give back to society, that you actually, they give you a social license for creating value in a way that gives back. And I think we need to experiment with that concept more in a data context, and also especially in an AI context, which is like, what is your social license to use the data as training data? Can you, and this morning we had, anyway, Emmanuel was referring to kind of the inclusion by design, but that would be kind of one way to actually establish this kind of inclusion by design as well. Now, in order to do that, right, you actually need to have some kind of innovation at three levels. One is that we need to innovate how we engage communities to identify their preferences, expectations, and their understanding on what the potential is, right? Because it's not just about preventing misuse, it's about making sure that data is being used for beneficial. And again, this morning, the other panel was talking about democratic innovation and so on, and I think that's really where this kind of democratic innovation can also come in. Citizens' assemblies, I mean, for instance, anyway, in some other work, I've developed kind of a data assembly in New York City, which was the first ever citizens' assembly around the reuse of data in New York City during COVID. And we need to, anyway, establish that more. Now, the challenge with a lot of those deliberations is then it quite often ends up with a report or with, anyway, some kind of intangible kind of understanding. And so that's the second area where we need to make innovation, which is then, what is then the codification of the preferences and expectations that then, and that's the third one, that then can be enforced, right? And so that's really where the report is focusing on. And then we look into a whole variety of kind of design questions, like who needs to be part of the deliberation, where is deliberation taking part, do we need to take some cultural norms into account? Like for instance, again, we had a discussion about if you do this in kind of an African context, that you may want to build yourself upon kind of Ubuntu principles.
Exactly.
And so I think we really need to become more sophisticated in the design of the deliberation, but also in how you then express that to a large extent as well. And that's what the report to a large extent is about. But obviously, we cannot just be conceptual. And so what we also tried to do in the report was to actually look, what is it already happening? And here I give the floor to Laura to reflect on a few kind of case studies that we studied across the low and middle income countries, and some of the lessons learned.
Yes. So like my colleague Stefan has mentioned, it was really important for us to find some use cases that highlighted these examples of citizen engagement in data reuse. So the primary example that we had found was in Colombia. And essentially this project aimed to develop a agroclimatic forecast system that was aimed to assist local farmers in improving their crop yields as well as mitigating any climate change impacts that has occurred over the years. And in this project, it was found that they had reused agricultural data as well, from different areas from the private and public sectors to develop this predictive system. And essentially, they focused on engaging all these different stakeholders through a co-decision, mainly through roundtables, which included scientists, experts, farmers, and the aim is to have discussion to understand how they could implement this system within the day-to-day life. And initially, this system was implemented in 6 rural localities, and it was successful enough to be up to 34 and ended up saving 3.6 million in savings. So the second use case that we had took place in Senegal, and it was actually a combined effort with Colombia. Since it was so successful, Senegal took a look at this process, and essentially what they wanted was to create a system that, a warning system for rainfall to help local farmers as well with their crops. And in this project, they had NGOs, public agencies, farmers all come together during a workshop to create the warning system platform. And they were able to discuss not only scientific findings, but also what are local findings to help improve the quality of the forecasting system. And so initially in 2011, when this had started, it only happened in Kaffrine, Senegal, but then was able to expand to 4 more rural populations. And by 2015, about 7.4 million people were using this system within Senegal. And lastly, we have our case in Nepal, where they wanted to develop a system for disaster management, an OpenStreetMap. And here, they heavily engaged their citizens and the local population to help manage the platform, because it's important for them for this system to continue on, not just at the initial phase of implementation, but as well to continue in case there are other disasters that occurred. And during this project, they reused geospatial data as well as other census information to create an OpenStreetMap for this disaster management. And so essentially those were the 3 main cases that highlighted the important factors that we deem successful in the social license.
Yeah, and these were, based upon that, these were some of the kind of takeaways. And I'm not going to go, anyway, we basically developed a taxonomy of different types of ways to establish kind of a social license. But it suffices to say is that, anyway, these were kind of case studies that were hard to find, and that it's still, anyway, definitely not common practice. And if you start thinking about the amount of possible data reuses, and we've, anyway, after a lot of search, we came up with only 3 that we actually could include. I think this is a moment where we as a community really have to do better in actually thinking about how do we innovate in providing this kind of self-determination and providing this kind of social license on how data is being reused without making it too burdensome so that it doesn't enable innovation in the space. Because that's actually the real design challenge, is like, how do you make sure they can prove you have the social license and at the same time be agile and sustainable as well. And I think that's really where we also started focusing on with regard to some of the recommendations, which is, anyway, again, I'm not going to go, everyone can read here and can read the report, because again, if I say too much, no one is going to read the report. So I'm just going to do some teaser here. But but I think I think some of the big takeaways was that we really need local engagement. But I think is then, anyway, the real opportunity for this space is that how do we develop a methodology where you can actually globally experiment with a similar kind of methodology, but then locally adjust to concerns, norms, and potential use cases as well. And that's also what we started developing, which is this kind of social license public engagement toolkit, where anyway we are trying to kind of codify a methodology on how do you establish a social license, what does good look like, and when anyway can you actually indicate that you did the due diligence in order to make sure that that expresses the preferences and also the expectations and norms of the community in a way that benefits the opportunity. And so from my point of view, in order to really unlock data reuse, I think what has stand in the way is actually the lack of data governance innovation, because we're still too much dependent on consent, which I think is very important, but we need to also complement it with actually a collective way of expressing what some of the preferred use cases might be, but also what the conditions might be under which that should happen. And that's what this report is all about.
Great. Thanks to both of you, Stefaan and Laura. Very good. Before I ask for questions on the floor, because I sense you have questions, I'm just looking at this framework which moves from, individual consent to much more a community-based approach, right? When will such a framework or approach not work? Like, are there cases when, individual consent should be taken into account, and cases when where we have to leverage on such a model?
Well, first of all, I think crystal clear is that we are not advocating to get rid of consent, right? I think, it's still a principle, but I think we should not be only reliable on consent, and we should actually, by the way, because quite often consent at the moment is like you consent to kind of the use of the data for the purpose for which you collect it. Now they've expanded sometimes and says, and for those purposes, we will also start using and reusing your data. But the question is then, was there even a community engagement to determine what the other purposes might be? And that's where social license can actually come into play to make consent more aligned with social expectations as well. But obviously, there are use cases where, for instance, this is all about empowering communities, right? Now, in some cases, communities are at a stage where they are so disempowered, right, that it's very even hard to get them involved in some of those cases, which is why then quite often you need then kind of representatives or proxies for that kind of empowerment. Just thinking like one problem that we have in New York City was how do you deal with undocumented migrants in order to have their expression of preferences and expectations on how their data is being used. Most of the time, if you hold a kind of let's get together, say, well, why would I get together? I want to remain undocumented. so it's already very hard to actually have that kind of conversation. And then it's about, what are kind of intermediary organizations that can, and that's also the thing, right? So we need to become sophisticated about, it doesn't always have to be individuals, right? It could also be organizations that represent and that have a public interest representation. That could be part of the who is taking place in that. But obviously, there are also cases where you actually need an urgent kind of reuse. Think about crisis, which is why those conversations should not happen at the point of crisis. They should happen before a crisis hit, where you actually have this kind of conversation about potential reuses and a social license. And the lesson learned from actually holding those data assemblies myself is that people are actually sophisticated, right, to have that conversation. Quite often they say, well, we need to do training and we need to, and clearly you want to introduce some scenarios where you introduce, for instance, anonymization, and you introduce some kind of concepts that might be less familiar, but they have strong views. And quite often those strong views are never really discussed in a collaborative fashion, and I think that's really the opportunity here.
Thank you for this enlightening presentation. Maybe some of you here in the room could have a question.
I think probably you
maybe it's better to use.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Jeremy Boy from UNDP. It's very interesting work. I'm interested, so if I understand correctly, you're building this whole framework on use cases, right? Did you look at non-use cases? Have you encountered situations where this social license wasn't granted? Because I like your point on consent being individual. It doesn't really matter if one individual doesn't give consent because of the sea of data, but if collectively there is no social license, what happens then? And did you look into that?
Maybe I could. Yes, so during the research for the use cases, as we had mentioned, it was already very difficult with the parameters of data reuse and citizen engagement. So from what we had seen, we didn't necessarily find a non-use case, but rather, for example, cases where they just reused data without the citizen engagement component to it. And whether that was successful or not, it was a bit more difficult to decipher whether it was because they didn't engage citizens or that aspect. So I don't think we had a non-use case, and I think if we found one, it would have been very interesting to see why it was denied the social license. But from our findings so far, we hadn't seen one exactly that would fall under the criteria that we were looking for, but rather just missing the citizen engagement altogether.
For this report, we didn't find anyway. But again, there are plenty. Just look at what happened during COVID, right? Meaning, it's like, meaning, how many of you were anyway asked during COVID whether you were okay with how data was reused, right? I think, and again, COVID was kind of a great opportunity to open up that conversation. That because most people realized that actually, yes, it makes sense to actually start using perhaps my cell phone data if it means that I actually know when there are hotspots, and that when it means, for instance, because that would have been the real opportunity of reusing data, basically it could have meant that we don't need to have a full lockdown. It could have basically meant that we would have precision lockdowns, right? Where we then really know that, anyway, this is kind of the area that, anyway, is kind of a hotspot, and so the rest can have liberty, but we didn't have that discussion, and as a result, there was a lot of kind of apprehension to even use that kind of data for precision interventions. And so, again, that shows the opportunity cost, both in terms of liberties, but also in terms of actually kind of possibilities, right? And I think we didn't find for this, but I think there are probably more non-use cases than use cases at this moment.
Hello, my name is Lorraine Porciunco. I'm with the DataSphere Initiative. First, I wanted to congratulate for the great work that you're doing. I think that the work of creating more taxonomy and vocabulary in the space is really, really crucial for us to advance our understanding on some of the trends that are very new as well, and trying to understand this field as a whole. One of my questions is on, and builds on some of your design questions as well, in terms of enforceability of that. When you think about the analogy with the extractive industries and social licensing in this field, this is attached to specific regulation that actually requires you to have a social license before you start your activities of extraction in a certain community. It comes with a lot of caveats as well. A lot of those social licenses are just pro forma. They put up an ad saying that they're going to consult the community. If one person shows up, they call it as having been done, right? And so there's a lot to learn on what not to do in this space as well. And that, understandably, in a space which is very regulated. The actors and the agents are well identified. Typically, you have regulators that are in charge of a specific and defined mandate with years of practice and building on a body of experience, right? In AI, it's still really new. The regulations are still being developed, and typically in a principles level. So my question is, how do you tie the enforceability of the need of those social licenses with the regulatory system as well, in terms of incorporating those tools as appropriate tools to then create this feedback loop with communities as well, at the same time that you are trying to build a whole new body of regulation? And so making sure that it's intentional, what it's being done, so that it doesn't die out in the level of the community is core. And I just wanted to, because I'm sure that you thought about this, we're going to do all this work and engage the community. And how is this enforced? We can have the most beautiful social license out there if we can't really identify who's collecting our data, using it for what purposes, and not even understand what's the enforceability path, particularly because it spans through multiple jurisdictions at once. How do we get there in terms of making them realized, right?
Yeah. Well, thanks for this easy question, Lorraine. It's always a pleasure to have. I'm joking, but yeah, no. Well, that's, as I said. I mean, these are the kind of. First of all, we would claim not to have all the answers, right? And I think part of the which is why it's so great to work with Peter and Amandine, is that part is to actually put this at the table, right? And say we need to be more creative, and we need kind of a new way of thinking about collective agency as it relates to the reuse of data. Social license is one way to perhaps go for that. And again, I mean, it might not be the real term that you want to use over time, but at least for me, it kind of resonates. But obviously, there is regulation, there's self-regulation, and I think regulation. Ideally, you would want to have it embedded in regulatory mechanism moving forward. I mean, my view is that if GDPR gets amended and reviewed in the next few years, I think social license should be part of kind of, how do we go about actually complementing the current regime, which is very much consent focused, and as a result, actually sometimes meaningless on how you actually get agency with regard to how your data gets done. So there's an opportunity there to actually socialize the regulators in alternative mechanisms or additional mechanisms. But of course, from a self-regulatory point of view, I think if this becomes the standard that says, look, it's not just a standard with regard to can you explain the algorithm, but part of the standard should be, and can you document whether you obtained the social license, that would become kind of more of an industry standard of best practice, right? And I think that's where we should move forward. And so here I've been planting it with kind of a standard-setting bodies who are developing because there's no common evaluation method at the moment for AI, right? That could become part of kind of the evaluation method for AI, especially as it relates to can you document that the outcome is aligned with the preferences and expectations of the communities. That would be kind of already a social license moving forward. But I think potentially more importantly is that if this becomes part of actually requirements by investors, right? Because that's also, the mining communities is super sensitive to being able to document they have a social license, because otherwise they would not get any investment, because that's now clearly part of their kind of ESG, without all the problems that ESG goes through these days, but it's clearly part of their kind of KPIs that they need to document as well. And so, for instance, I was in Mongolia kind of 3 months ago, where the main mine of Mongolia, OT, which is kind of 30% of the GDP of Mongolia, has decided to actually experiment with the social license for their data, and with also establishing this other concept, data stewardship, as well, which goes hand in hand. And so, and the reason why they did that is because the World Bank, IFC, is looking into making it a requirement for actually investment as well, right?
Thank you for the great presentation, and congratulations. My name's Reina from UNDP as well. I do wonder, like, did you look at other types of ways of mitigating these risks? And probably you came to this conclusion after considering different things. And so I'd love to hear what those were, or what other options were. And also, the other analogy that came to mind while listening to you was the access and benefit sharing. So you might know the Nagoya Protocol says if you use a genetic resource in a local community, you have to give back some kind of benefit. And that also comes to mind because right? Like a lot of donors are now asking to open the data that gets collected, and that involves indigenous communities and local communities. So I'd love to hear what you have, around access and benefit sharing types of thinking as well. Thanks.
You want to address some of that? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Hi. Yeah. Thank you very much. It was fascinating. Really enjoying the presentation. My question's a bit similar actually, because when you have like multi-stakeholder funding, the idea is you have something that can be self-sustainable. So often there's an economic model built into it. So how do you balance that tension between data reuse that people understand, and then a sense perhaps that that data may be expropriated afterwards if it's reused in other projects and it's monetized, and that the initial stakeholders feel that maybe they've been excluded, particularly with AI, right? Because there's lots of different use cases that can come from it. Yeah.
What comes to mind sorry.
No, I'll take another question and then.
Sorry, I had a similar line of questioning as well in terms of benefit sharing for collective data use and the longevity of that, similar to that question there. But it strikes me, and the reason why I ask is from a different perspective, because you use the example of extractive industries as a use case. And yeah, I wouldn't call it inspirational from my perspective, because most of the communities, I work for the Open Development Initiative. We're based in Asia. We work with indigenous populations who are severely impacted by extractive industries. And consent is one thing, but free, prior, and informed consent is a different concept. And it's a different concept because it allows communities to actually have benefit sharing over the lands. So it's not only about consent for the mining companies to extract, but also for continued and ongoing rights to those resources. And so that's a different aspect. And so I think you can't quite draw the same parallels. And the term self-determination, of course, is used heavily in Indigenous high-level forums, and I think it's very important to not repurpose language for generalized consent or determination rights, because I think they are distinct and different for certain populations. And then my last question is about restitution. So if you do have cases where there are benefits and conflicts, how do you find justice in these contexts of social contracts that may change and shift over time?
Okay.
These are all hard questions, so I ask Laura to answer.
Yeah.
I like the question.
They're all very good. So I think the one that I can definitely answer that you had asked in terms of reusing data and what that means for the public. In the use case that we had in Nepal, so we had conducted interviews with the project leads during, who had conducted these projects. And essentially, even though it was geospatial data that was being reused as well as census data, which is available, what they had done was to ensure they had actually specifically asked the local people, can we reuse this data? And then it was a lot of building trust in terms of it's for purpose A, B, C, D, to make sure that if a disaster happens, we are able to have enough information to have rescue operations. So they really tried to, I guess, verbally and distinctly, present the benefits to the population, to the public, in terms of why they need to reuse this data. And essentially in this process, they were able to build a lot of trust, and they also had workshops where people could see how this data was being used, how they could manage the data themselves, and heavily involved the public in this disaster management system. So essentially, the people could see where their information was going and how it would benefit them in the future. So that was a very, eye-opening way that even though this data is widely available, people do still, they would like to know how it's being used, if it's being used again. So I think in terms, I hope that answers that question. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Mm. Mm. Yeah.
Yeah, well, but that's, yeah, again, as I mentioned, we don't suggest that this will solve all the challenges, right? Because this is already, anyway, and again, one of the areas that are really, and again, perhaps with all of you, if you're interested, or really want to dive deeper, is exactly how do you enforce, first of all, how do you express the expectations over, anyway, for multiple users, including so-called derivatives, right? Which, and again, when you talk with any lawyer about derivatives, they're going to have a different answer because that's already kind of a very, anyway, from a legal perspective, contentious, especially when it comes to data, right? Contentious kind of field, which is why I think we need, because I looked into, can we use existing licensing regimes to do this, right? And my conclusion was that actually existing data licensing regimes are actually not up to the task, right? And which is why we need, anyway, kind of innovation also in licensing. And again, I use social license not per se as in, or we use social license not per se as in kind of a legal construct, but it could be a legal construct that sets terms and conditions, including terms and conditions for derivative kind of uses of that kind of data, which then goes back to how do you get benefit sharing, and that could be part of the, anyway, ultimately, most of those things are done in a contractual way, right? And so the question is, do we need a kind of a new contractual means? The problem with contractual means is quite often what mentioned there as well, is that most of those contracts are quite often established at the time of power asymmetries, right? Where actually who sets the contract and who sets the conditions is quite often not based upon notions of principled negotiation, which again should be part of social licensing. So it's a much more deeper concept that we need to develop as well. And again, in the kind of benefits, I think it's, anyway, sharing benefits is I would feel more comfortable with that concept than selling your data, which is the other model, right, that has been suggested, is that why don't you monetize your data so that you have direct benefits? Well, we all know that anyway, leads actually to more extraction and quite often a deal that is, anyway, kind of unfair. But if you, anyway, can document these were the benefits that were established under those conditions, then there could be kind of a more sharing approach. And I totally get the critique is that, anyway, clearly social license in the extractives industry has many problems with itself. But as a concept, right, not per se the practice that we have today, but I think as a concept, it's something that we definitely need to consider. And then if we decide, anyway, it's not working, then at least we considered an alternative to consent, which I think is very hard to establish. Now, there are other methods, we looked into other methods as well, such as, anyway, the kind of the ownership model, because that's why I use determination, not ownership per se, because, again, in the data space, ownership is a really complicated and an unsolved problem, to be quite honest. If you look at all the legal cases around ownership of data, there is no consensus, right? Who actually owns data? And of course, you could say, well, in the context of data sovereignty with indigenous communities, it's a different kind of context, which I agree, but that's different kind of application as well. And so that were kind of the limitations that I saw. And then also, of course, the other option is that, well, we need to, anyway, have better consent mechanisms. That's a possible pathway, but then it's still very individual, right? So you don't really advance the kind of collective, right? And also all the kind of innovation in decentralized ownership, a decentralized management of your own personal data, I think is interesting. It's desirable, but it doesn't solve the collective problem, right? And so those are the kinds of challenges that we've seen.
So I think we have to wrap up. I would just ask the last question. So as you emphasized earlier, so privacy and social consent license are complementary, privacy being focused on the individual information and consent, and social license more on the community level. But what challenges do you foresee for the widespread adoption of social license in the future, and how can they be addressed? The challenges for the social license to be the wide adoption of social license models.
Yeah, no shortage of challenges here, but I think, well, again, I go back to my three-pronged areas that where we need to make progress, right? First challenge is, how do we become more sophisticated in engaging communities, right? In a way that really is meaningful and that can really establish this kind of expectations and preferences. And that was also the topic this morning of the other panel, which is that we need democratic innovation, but then how do we do this in a way that actually is meaningful? Second challenge is then, how do we advance licensing, right? And I think we need, I mean, again, in the AI space, very interesting, there are all kinds of alternative licensing coming up, like the rail licenses and so on, but they all have kind of limitations, and they are not based upon kind of a social consensus. So we need to, anyway, really make progress there. And then the third one, how do we enforce it? And here, I think we eventually may need some kind of enforcement mechanism, whether these are regulatory or whether this is kind of a naming and shaming kind of exercise with regard to social license applications. But I think we do need to invest in those kinds of areas. And I think those are the three where we need to make progress. At the same time, none of these are impossible, right? And I think that's where we need to do, anyway, we need to step up. And this report might be the kind of the first trigger to actually get a broader community to actually start looking into that, right?
Great. I've been signaled this time with 5 minutes ahead of time. I'd like to thank all of you. Thanks to the speakers and also to Amandine for helping in co-moderating this session and also contributing to providing insights in the report. The report is online, available on AFD website for free. It can easily be downloaded. I'd like to thank all participants, and it's also a call to participants online and also here to see how best we can collaborate and move forward together on initiatives leveraging on data and also emerging technologies for development. I'd like to thank all the partners, the technical team, the communication team for helping us throughout this particular event. Thanks a lot, and catch up on the next session. Bye for now.
And maybe I can also just say a quick thank you to Natalia and Elena, who also contributed to this report and unfortunately couldn't be here today, but they were amazing. And I just want to say thank you because they are watching live stream. So thank you.
Cheers.